The Pittsburgh Penguins seem to be heading for a rebuild, at least according to recent reports. Pens GM Kyle Dubas has made it clear to everybody around the NHL that just about everybody on their roster other than Sidney Crosby is available for trade. As I record this, the Penguins are 6-9-3 on the year through 18 games, with only 15 points and a .417 point percentage. They are the third worst team in the Metro Division, second worst if you go by point percentage, and the only team they'd be ahead of is the perpetually rebuilding Columbus Blue Jackets. So the idea behind a rebuild makes a lot of sense. And this is a really odd position for the Pittsburgh Penguins to be in, given that they've never really had to rebuild ever since Crosby and Malkin came into the NHL. Even the last 2 years when they missed the playoffs, they were buyers at the deadline and seemed to have a path to the playoffs that lasted all the way up until the very last days of the season. So to rebuild the Pittsburgh Penguins in a year or two is no easy task, especially because last year they didn't have their first round pick, which ended up being the 14th overall pick because they traded away in the Erik Karlsson trade. Going into the season, they had the 23rd ranked prospect pool among NHL teams according to the hockey writers, and every team that's ranked with a worse prospect pool than them is 500 or better on the season. So the Pens have a lot of ground to make up. And to me, looking at the Pittsburgh Penguins, there are really only two paths forward. The first is a reload, rebuild like their rivals, the Washington Capitals, did a couple of years ago, which is basically to not concede on the entire Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin era, believe in the talent of those players, and think with a few tweaks and changes, a reinvigoration of energy, we could be competitive again within a year or two. A couple of years ago, the Washington Capitals fired Peter Laviolette, they hired Spencer Carberry, they unloaded a bunch of their older contracts, trading away guys like Lars Eller, Dmitry Orlov, Garnet Hathaway, Marcus Johansson, but very importantly, keeping a lot of guys that they could have been expected to trade, like TJ Oshie, Nick Backstrom, John Carlson. They kept those guys as their core that they would build around later and traded around the fringes. 2 years later, they made the playoffs last year, and this year they seem poised to do so again, mainly built around that core that they preserved from a couple of years ago. This is the path I would expect the Pittsburgh Penguins to go, because honestly, they have a lot of players that they might want to trade who are on long-term contracts. It's like Brian Rust, Rickard Rakell, and Ryan Graves. Those are all guys that you would probably want to see if you could get rid of, but they've got term on their deals. Malkin's got a couple of years left, Crosby's got 3 years left, Letang and Karlsson both have a few years left. Those contracts will be hard to trade, and you probably won't get ideal value for them, so could just look to trade on the fringes like Marcus Pettersson, Matt Grzelcyk, maybe Michael Bunting, get some mid-round picks, hope you end up in the top 10 with your draft pick this year and add somebody good, but you're basically just kind of doing a retool. The other option is to just completely burn it down and rebuild, kind of like the Calgary Flames did last year, where they traded everybody that they could, got as many picks as they could, and committed to the long path. And in this scenario, which is what it seems to be if you're telling teams that everybody on the roster is available, except for Sidney Crosby, then everybody on the roster should be available, including Sidney Crosby. If you're going to commit to the full teardown, you can't half measure it. You have to be willing to trade everybody, especially the guy who's probably worth the most in terms of trade value return. Because the thing is, if the Pittsburgh Penguins trade away everybody but Crosby, they're still probably good enough to not finish dead last in the league and have the best possible odds to win the draft lottery, which means you're not getting those generational talents that you need to really build around for the future. And if you want to keep Sidney Crosby here, to me, that's signaling that you're not willing to do that. The Caps weren't a couple of years ago, and that worked out fine for them. And I'm not going to lie, that's also a very risky path, because you have to get the head coaching hire right. You have to already have some guys in the pipeline who can step up, like Connor McMichael and Rasmus Sandin, who they acquired at that deadline, are going to be able to do. So burning it all down might just be the easiest way to go, but if you're going to do it, fully commit to that, or just fully commit to the rebuild and retool. Don't half measure it, or you risk becoming the worst kind of team in sports, a team that's stuck in purgatory.